Some of you did not have the privilege to listen to Dr. Scott. His teaching plays on the network throughout the week. I strongly recommend you tune in to the website. They'll put up the graphics for those people later on who are watching on the replay on an on-air station. His method of teaching was Gestalt. And he would throw enough things at you from different angles that at some point, amidst the confusion, a light would come on. Now, I don't really know that my style, I've told you, is more like taking a bucket and just dumping it on you. And eventually, you know, you start to kind of put together the pieces. And yes, it's a little bit like Gestalt on steroids, maybe. But what dawned on me is, after some of you heard the recent festival program I did, talking about a program that I had seen, one of those Bible programs on TV, not a religious television, but a supposedly educational, which was completely skewed and had just a lot of misinformation in it, which made me just plumb angry, particularly because the person who was the key figure, actually, after I did my homework on this individual, has written a couple of books and comes across as somewhat of an authority, but whoever either edited, I'm not quite sure what happened, but it left me scratching my head. So that was the negative side. I shared that with you on festival. The positive side is it taught me a lesson. The lesson is that I actually watched this program with someone who has very little biblical knowledge. And I say very little as opposed to my knowledge. Let's just say it's all relative and perhaps subjective, but indulge me. Long enough to realize that a little bit of information skewed, put into hands that have not studied the Bible very long or very thoroughly, is very dangerous. And I realized that what was missing were some important foundational pieces. This had the potential, this program had the potential to at least give the foundation of instructional blocks to trace steps, but instead facts were blurred and homogenized. And as I begin to look at the future, the next few weeks, I realized that I have to lay down some pieces that perhaps will be instrumental for the sake of those people who don't have the history of teaching here on the Lost Tribes, and the mention and reference of those that occur in the final chapters of Ezekiel for the land apportionment, and in the book of Revelation, as these, with the exception of a few, one or two, are called preachers of righteousness, the 144,000. So I'm laying down some pieces which at the first seem rather simplistic and they're basic building blocks. However, I've never done something like this before, which is take a step back and reconsider how I want to take people along with me who have little or no frame of reference, because there are plenty of people who are listening, and I will use terminology. There are words you can simply go look up in a dictionary, and there's no harm, no malice, but there are other things that you might go look up, and in the process of looking them up, you're going to come across a lot of information where people seem to be quite knowledgeable. The information may even seem very tenable and plausible, but unless you can thread everything together, remember I said the Bible must confirm itself to make doctrine. Anybody who just lifts something out randomly, waves it around, or beats you over the head with it, you should not be listening. Sorry, folks, that's just, that's good advice. Having said that, this method may be a little bit different, a different way of approach. So I don't want you to think of today, even though today's message is isolated, I want you to think of today's message as in terms of what may be a series of messages that will be building blocks for everyone. So, with that being said, let me start, that was all introduction. Let me start by saying The Bible, the New Testament, Paul sums it up really plainly. He says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That glory is Christ. But let's just say you didn't have confidence that all have sinned like Paul did, and he said he was the chiefest of sinners. You could go to 2 different Psalms and read how in both places the Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. And the other text, God looked down from heaven, very similar, upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and that did seek God. Every one of them is gone back. They're altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good. A repetition, if you will. But put these and some others alongside what Paul says, and one must come to the conclusion that there are a few righteous in the Bible. When we say a few righteous, we're talking about men such as Enoch, who there is no record of him committing any egregious sin. There is no record of his shortfalling. However, that being said, still born in the image of sinning man. Just keep that in mind, no matter how righteous we encounter the people in the pages. And please don't make these people caricatures. This is so important because underneath every single message, this should tap on the hearts of every single person who walks right on the cusp, knowing their faith, knowing that they have placed their trust in Christ for their salvation, and yet with a tender heart, always somehow, whether it be by the devil's persuasion or by the conscious awareness of sin that is ever present, we walk with a sense that even though I might say I am cleansed, I need that daily cleansing. For without his wonderful gift in my life, I am filthy, I am unclean, I am undone, gone back, gone astray, just like all of these references I just made. Now, there are people in the Bible who get a bad rap. A few weeks ago, when I was talking about the tribe of Dan, and I said to you, and we'll talk about the tribes. I want to make sure that I lay down enough information for those of you who are just coming to listen that you're going to, what? But I mentioned Dan as being left out, for example, in the 144,000 preachers of righteousness in the book of Revelation. And perhaps, I'm sure, there is a good reason. But if we were to simply imagine that it is because Dan was the tribe of Dan was one of the first to lead the people into idolatry, that would be a poor reasoning to simply eliminate Dan, because I can go through each and every one of the original, we'll call them sons of Jacob, Israel, who make up essentially the tribes, and tell you that there is very little good, save perhaps if we're talking about Joseph and what we might liken him to as a type of Christ. But each one of these had some really staggering situations, and we'll call them beyond staggering, we'll call them sinful. Judah, one of the children of Israel, Jacob, who became Israel. He's recorded as loving the women and wealth. And, you know, not too many preachers preach on that chapter pertaining to Judah. But he does not have a very stellar record. And you've got to go and read that on your own. I've referenced it here a couple of times. And if you were to look on his sin, the thing he did, it's pretty egregious. Yes? Is anybody familiar with that passage? Okay, some of you, not all of you. And then you've got people like Simeon and Levi, who took vengeance on the one who raped their sister Dinah. And although they took vengeance and slew the men who were guilty of the crime, they got a pretty bad rap because one had a big mouth and the other one just never had any good ideas. But they killed people. So let's be careful about how we line up when we examine these people. we have a tendency to paint them as far removed. They are not like us. And that's just a tragedy. So today I want to talk about the firstborn of the sons of Jacob. The firstborn child is Reuben. Now, I've never preached a message on Reuben, and I don't really know that what I'm doing here is really preaching a message per se on Reuben. It's painting a picture to understand three things. I'm going to use all P words, that is position, property, and promise to him. He was the firstborn. And there is the law of primogeniture that is spread through this book, that simply being the law of the firstborn, the rule of the firstborn that would essentially at the death of the father inherit a double portion of the inheritance of property, would, if we were looking at and targeting from Abram down to Isaac, down to Jacob, we would be looking at the line that leads us to Messiah. And there are many other things, priest in the home, not priest as in Levitical priest or Aaronic priest, but priest in the home, head of the home. So these are important things to consider when we talk about the law of primogeniture. Now, there are many people in the Bible, at least I would say a few that come to my mind. Specifically, we're talking about Reuben, who forfeited his birthright because of something he did. And just like his uncle Esau. Remember Esau, Jacob's brother, sold his birthright because he was hungry for a bowl of pottage. He sold his birthright because he thought he would die of hunger. And they're very subtle. As I get older, I realize that these are not just some, simple little Bible stories that you can just, read, and you can read them and enjoy them, but there are some very profound truths in there. How easy it is to get caught up in the flesh, how easy it is to get caught up in the world, how easy it is to think of the now instead of looking at what lays ahead. And that's exactly what Esau did. The New Testament talks to us in the book of Hebrews. I mentioned this last week. Be not like that profane person Esau, referring to one not discerning spiritual things. What he gave up for what he received. It's really not a good deal. Now, in the big picture, it's almost as though God has this pattern. If you want to go back to Adam in the garden and think about Adam as clay marred in the hand of the potter. God created, formed Adam out of the ground, gave him a helpmate in Eve, and these were living in perfect communion until it says that Eve was beguiled by the serpent, ate of the tree for which they were told they were not to eat of, and this event plunged Adam and Eve into a sin condition. The blueprint from then on of every child born is in fallen man, not in perfect man. We receive, as Christians, we receive that perfect man in Jesus Christ. But the interesting thing is, before Christ even came, the great prophecy out of Genesis that tells us the anticipation, God looking on his marred creation, marred in his hand, by the way. God wasn't absent when this happened, but marred in his hand. And all you've got to do is follow the pattern through the book. What all of these people, in investigating their lives and studying their lives, speak to me about very clearly is exactly what I quoted out of these Psalms. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek. They're all gone aside. They're altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Paul picks it up, as I said in the New Testament. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So when we begin a study like this, I want it to be abundantly clear. I'm not picking at an event and like some preachers would do, under the guise of exploiting the information, actually frothing at the mouth because I get to talk about something that has some lasciviousness to it. Because some, I've told you the story of going to preach in the institution. Some of the musicians were with me, and chaplain, all he wanted to do was talk about fornication. Think about this, and oh boy. So, what I'm saying to you is this has a good, solid foundation for us to better understand that nobody is perfect, that the concept that some people just keep as a caricature, that somehow you can come into the church and somehow you can live this life where, and I've met people like this, they tell you, they don't do this, they don't do that. They have some idea that they are perfect and living in perfection, and they deceive themselves. This is the greatest tragedy. You either encounter people who are completely oblivious, or people who say, well, I was saved, I was sanctified, I got baptized, I got catechized, or whatever other I's you can think of, and now I don't do any of that. And they just lied to you. So this is why I've said this repeatedly. It's so important for me, especially because I read the messages, and there are people out there that have not ever called in, they've never written a letter, they've never shared their experience, but I know it's the experience that is common to every single individual. And that is, if you're true with your own self, you recognize how short you have fallen along the pathway of life. That's not to beat yourself and condemn yourself and to wear yourself down, but rather the reality, just like Paul, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? O wretched man that I am, O wretched woman that I am. And you come to realize your sin is much greater than the things that you can check a box for. And this is why we're cautioned to not neglect so great a salvation, and to look unto the Savior and to recognize that He died for me. He died for you. And this death bought up the penalty I should have incurred. I should be, but not. He took it for me. He paid the price. So with that being said, I want us to take a look at the life of Reuben. You'll find his life. I've never preached a message on Reuben before, so don't say you heard this one before. If you did, you're a liar. But we have many a time talked about this, and it's necessary that I give the proper beginning for this. As I mentioned, Abraham, who has Isaac, the child of promise, and Isaac will have 2 boys, Jacob and Esau. And from the get-go, the scripture talks about these 2 boys and Jacob's nature as a heel catcher. Even from inside the womb, the scripture says, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. It's kind of a sad situation. You're not even out the gate and there's already a label on you. Talk about the deck being stacked against you. Now with that being said, if you're moving through the passages in the book of Genesis, you find that Jacob essentially tricks his father into giving him the blessing that essentially would have been bestowed upon Esau. There's a double thing going on. Esau sold his birthright, and the blessings that accompany it, Jacob, good old Jacob, who later becomes Israel, tricks his sorely blind dad into blessing him. And hence begins the journey where Jacob is essentially on the run, and he goes to stay with Laban, a relative. And it's with Laban that Jacob first sees a woman that he finds irresistible. Now there are 2 sisters. The one that he likes is Rachel. She had a sister who was not so hot, named Leah. And good old Laban said, if you work for me, you can have Rachel. You can marry her. And again, I've said this 1,000 times. I'll never understand how this could be, but on the night when they were to consummate their relationship, and he went in unto her and knew her, and he was tricked. You can imagine when he woke up to sunlight, there was no electric light, sunlight, and saw that he was with the ugly one. And Laban says, okay, well, you can have the sister too, but you can work for her and you can have her too. It's an interesting series of events, but that brings us to what I've called the most interesting chapter in the Bible, because what happens with Jacob is he begins to produce what we refer to later on as the house of Israel. And we begin to see him producing children at a record rate. Now, what's interesting is that Rachel is barren. She cannot have children. It's a very strange thing in the Bible that the one that he loves, that he wants to have children with, cannot bear him a child. But the ugly one, man, she's just popping him out. And I guess what is so crazy about this whole passage is that it is between Rachel and Leah and their two handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, that produce what we refer to as the house of Israel. These, later on, plus the adopted half Egyptian sons of Joseph, will make up the tribes of Israel that will be referred to later on as lost but are not lost. Just remember that. This is the important part. So what we have is Reuben, the firstborn, and I can almost imagine the event of the birth of the first child. Now in your King James, you've got some textual issues. That's why I've got several different passages open in front of me and different things to look at. But the translation, behold a son, or look a son, for Reuben. And that may actually be one of the translations. Some also have said that it could be look in my agony or in my sorrow, but that's from a different translator's perspective. The point is here that at the birth of this son, I can only imagine what the household, imagine the birth of a son in that day and age. If you had sons, you had it made. If you had daughters, a son meant your line would be perpetuated. A son meant you would actually have wealth, and your prosperity and posterity were guaranteed based on the fact of having sons. So here's the first son. And it is Leah who will produce the first few children. And then, of course, as I said, the handmaids will produce. And ultimately, Rachel will cry out in great agony. And she'll even actually tell Jacob, what's the matter with you? And he says, am I God to decide? In that moment, it says that God opened up her womb and she conceived. Now, there's a great tapestry going on here, and I don't want to get caught up in too much reading at this point because there's things I will have to read from. But what's important is that each one of these sons, essentially, apart from Joseph was the favorite son. Why? Because he was the son of the favorite wife, Rachel. So I want you to imagine in the mind of Reuben, who is the firstborn, who knows, by the way, they know the law. There is no law yet, but the rule, we'll call it, before there was a law, of the firstborn and the birthright. I want you to imagine Reuben watching his dad dote over another son that's not in the first position. First of his favorite wife, but not first as such as Reuben was. So we have already a seed planted, and at your own leisure you can read the details. What I want to stress is that there is no mention anywhere that Jacob said, I hate this son. He just favored Joseph. And that's some mystery in the back of my mind when I read this, that it's not until Jacob, who is Israel, lay dying and blesses each one of the children, does it actually come out in articulation so many years later of what the father knew the son had done to forfeit his position, even though he is still given a blessing or a description of a blessing first in line. Now, again, I've kind of tried to speed this thing up because I want to get into some other details, but the relevant thing here is that you can be assured of one thing, just as I talked about some others, Simeon and Levi, who committed, they thought, revenge in going to slay the men who raped their sister Dinah. And Judah, who will later on do the unthinkable with his daughter. And if you keep going down the road, you will find over and over again there are these unthinkable acts. And yet, each of these people are going to be given a blessing of some sort. Their posterity will continue, we know, because certainly by the time you get into Moses' day, which is way ahead, a long time away, we have the tribes that will surround the tabernacle as they move the tabernacle, that take up their stations, and they are all there. And we could keep going and we could keep talking about how God kept and maintained. Now, what's the most important thing I want to tell you? These men, all, for the most part, except for Joseph, had serious downfalls in their life. And yet, God did not completely write any of them off. If you think about it, I just mentioned Judah, and I want you to give this some thought because we know it's out of the line of Judah that the Messiah comes. I want you to think of the beginnings of Judah and think about, would this, to anybody looking on, who would even be contemplating this, the grace of God is written right there. That if you understand what Judah did in his sinful behavior, the grace of God is there to keep going on with fallen man. Perhaps that's the most important thing I'm going to say today, because each one of these tribes, each one of these men and their descendants should have been wiped out completely, should have been blotted off the map, and yet God did not. Even the ones of the tribe of Benjamin who were reduced down to a small minority, God even made a provision for them to go into a neighboring town. I believe they went to Shiloh, and as the women came out to dance, they took for themselves wives so that they could repopulate. Now, anybody looking in on what I'm saying today may be saying, what was she trying to say? I'm trying to tell you that the beginnings of understanding, when you look around this vast universe and you see myriad numbers of people who essentially populate the face of the earth, the origins, as we begin to trace back and we begin to look at where these peoples from all of the earth came from, you've almost got to go backwards far enough to realize that somewhere you're going to be tracing not all, but somewhere from these lineages. Not all, because there were other people we know, there were other children, there were other brothers and sisters, for example, of Adam. Adam and Eve had a child, and then it's recorded that they had 2 boys and they had another son, but they also had girls that are not recorded here because that's how the sons repopulated the earth. So with that being said, the relevance here is to really put something in perspective. Reuben, as the firstborn, should have had the birthright promise nailed down, but he does something that is right at the very place where Rachel is giving birth to her last child. She's in terrible pain. She dies during that childbirth. The child is born, Benjamin. And what is terrible is right after that event that Reuben goes in and sleeps with the concubine, Bilhah. And this will come out later in the blessing where the dad, Jacob, who is Israel, will say, you defiled my bed. And what's so interesting is, from out of the Bible, I step out of the Bible from it. It's interesting to see how people will handle these very difficult things to wrap our mind around. There are people who read the Bible who do not want to admit, here is the perfect case, incest and adultery. Now, I'm not trying to build a checklist for you. I'm simply pointing out what he did. But there are many people who read the Bible who would change the essence and the meaning of what is being said because it's just too easy to say we have to sterilize. We've got to clean it up so that it can be acceptable and everybody can be happy with the situation. Now, in Genesis 35, I said that Rachel was giving birth to Benjamin. 35:19, it says Rachel died. Now, I want you to think that Bilhah is Rachel's handmaid, but also was given as a concubine, if you will, to produce children when she was barren to Jacob. So at the death of Rachel, think about this. Poor Jacob being full of grief. You think, and I think it's completely tenable to believe that he might have gone in to Bilhah for, I'm not talking about knowing her again, but for comfort, because she was close to his favorite wife. Rachel died, and then it says in verse 22, it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard it. Now, it's a very strange thing, depending on what source you're looking at. There are some ancient manuscripts who break verse 22 to read something like this, which is why, if you look, you'll see right after concubine, there is a break in the King James. At least in my Bible, it's punctuated with a break, and Israel heard it. And that is because some of the ancient manuscripts break it in part, wanting you to read that there is something that has happened in between that is not necessarily recorded or expounded upon here. Now, hold that thought for just a minute. If you want to know how things can get really crazy, this is the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan of Genesis, and this is how they cleaned up the matter. While Israel dwelt in that land, Reuben went and disarranged the couch of Bilhah, his father's, it's not even spelt right, concubine, which had been arranged opposite the couch of Leah, his mother, and it was reckoned to him as if he had lain with her. It was reckoned to him as if he had lain with her. Now listen, if it was reckoned as if, here's the thing, he either did it or he didn't do it. Because if he didn't do it, then he would have still been the recipient. Even though Joseph was the favorite, he still would have been the recipient as the firstborn. There's funny stuff here. And this goes on to say, when Israel heard this, he was distressed, and he said, "Whoa." He said, "Whoa." Wait a minute, let me do that again. He said, "Whoa." I don't think he said it like that. "Perhaps an unworthy person has gone forth from me, as Ishmael went forth from Abraham and Esau went forth from my father." Now, let that sink in for a little bit. There's another passage which is equally disturbing, which I printed out, and it's a discussion out of the Babylonian Talmud, and I decided to print it out rather than haul the whole slew of books with me because I really did not think that was a good idea. This is what goes on in the Babylonian Talmud. Whoever maintains that Reuben sinned is merely making an error. Wait a minute. Can we go back and take a look at that error again? For it is said, now the sons of Jacob were 12, teaching they were all equal. Yes, they were all sinners. Think of that. He's not saying that I am. That's the thing that when we read, we have to put flesh and blood. We have to see these people selected and special, yes, but equal in the eyes of God, as in all have fallen short. He goes on to say, then how do I interpret that he lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine? I would advise him to say just that. This teaches that he transposed his father's couch, and the writ imputes blame to him as though he had lain with her. Again, they clean it up too. It was taught by Rabbi Simeon ben Elziar that a righteous man was saved from that sin, and that deed did not come to his hand. It is, I'm going to leave that one alone. It is possible that his seed was destined to stand on Mount Ebal and proclaim, "Cursed be he that lieth with his father's wife." Yet this sin should come to his hand. How do I interpret this? That he lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine? He resented his mother's humiliation. Said he, if my mother's sister was a rival to my mother, shall the bondmaid of my mother's sister be a rival to my mother? Thereupon he arose and transposed her couch. So, wait a minute, let me get this straight. Reuben's furniture moving service? No, I don't think so. Not buying that one, so let's put that one aside. I know you can just count on me to say something strange like that. From the book of Jubilees, so you get a different perspective. Jacob went and dwelt toward the north, and it says Reuben saw Bala, not Bilhah, but Bala, same person, the maid of Rachel, the concubine of his father, while she was bathing in water at a hidden place, and he loved her. This has shades of David and Bathsheba to it. Watching her bathe, he's a peeping Tom. He hid himself at night. Listen, it's in the Bible. This is why I do not like when people come to church and they want to put stained glass on every single thing that's in this book, and they want stained glass on their behavior. This is the stuff that is in the hearts and minds, if you want to call it even a speck of sand, that resides in the mind, in the human mind and heart. It's the stuff that tells me that there's nothing wrong with me and there's nothing wrong with you, save the fact that I'm a sinner saved by grace. It's the lot of every single person born into this world to wrestle out. And if God be so gracious as to send his hand and his spirit upon you, to open up your eyes and it become a reality of your fallen condition, and you seek that which is able to save, then I'd say to you, you're going to do away with the stained glass stuff real quick. Just give me the real stuff and keep it to where a person like me, I'm speaking to me, I'm not talking down to you, I'm speaking to me, can find comfort, can find the wisdom of God to keep something like this and not whitewash it and not say, well, we ought to not preserve this type of a story. No, in fact, that's what the sages tried to do. They wanted to keep the honor of Reuben, but I'd prefer to lay it all out there. Just like David's sin was laid bare by Nathan, thou art the man. And yet God did not remove his hand. Maybe David was not as victorious thereafter in his endeavors, but God did not remove his hand from him. And until he numbered the people, he did not even remove his spirit. Now, that's not to say go out and knock yourself out with whatever you want to do. That's just to say God is a gracious God and a merciful God. And if people will hear that message nestled in between the foundation of what will become the lost tribes teaching, it's important, which ties us into the end times and the book of Revelation. It's important to recognize God's grace and God's love. And yes, God will judge accordingly. But for those who are in Christ Jesus, Romans 8 says, there is therefore now no ultimate condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. Whatever happened in your past is covered by the blood. And only the accuser of the brethren or some self-righteous pseudo-Christian would come and remind you of your shortfallings and prod you to doubt Christ and the efficacy of the price he paid. Now, with that being said, let me read on. He hid himself at night. He entered into the house of Bala at night and found her lying alone on her bed and sleeping. And he lay down with her. And she awoke and saw, and behold, Reuben was lying with her on the bed. And she uncovered the edge, keep your mind here for a minute, and seized him and cried out, Lord help me, no, I said that, and discovered that it was Reuben. If it was dark, there must have been a methodology to discovering it wasn't who she thought it was. Keep your mind on the Lord. For she was ashamed of his account and let her hand from him, and he fled. She lamented on account of this thing exceedingly and did not mention it to anybody. When Jacob returned and sought her, she said to him, I am not clean for thee, for I have been defiled for thee, for Reuben has defiled me and lay with me in the night, and I was asleep and did not discover it until he uncovered the edge, and he lay with me. Jacob was very angry at Reuben that he had lain with Bala, for he had uncovered the covering of his father, and Jacob did not approach her any more because Reuben had defiled her, for his deed was very wicked, for it is accursed before the Lord. Now, what's interesting is you've got a really delicate balance between the Book of Jubilees, which gives a very explicit account, and the Targums and the Talmud that want to whitewash and clean it up. But there's one thing that cannot be mistaken, and that is if you read on at the end of the record, you've got the blessings that are going to be named. Let me give a little detail because I've got a few minutes. As Joseph, favored son, is left in a pit and sold off on a slave train, carted away to Egypt to rot in a prison until he's let out because he interprets Pharaoh's dream and ascends to the highest ranking person in the land, second to Pharaoh, has a wife there in Egypt, has 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh, who will also be part of the tribes. And there's a great famine in the land. Remember, God's a faminizer. There was a great famine in the land. Jacob, who is Israel, will send his at least 2, if not 3, off to seek food during the famine. They approach Joseph. When it's uncovered, when it's discovered that it is indeed their brother, there's a great reunion. And of course, Joseph beckons that all the family would come and be with them. There's room enough for all, food, and so forth. And they make their journey into Egypt, which is how, when the book of Exodus opens, it says, after the death of Joseph, there rose up a Pharaoh who did not know. Now, that's another story for another day, but before the death of Jacob, who is Israel, I want you to kind of wrap some excitement around this. The old man's going to die. Like the reading of the will, except there was no will, it all had to come out of his mouth. And I can just see all the kids gathered around to listen. And I can imagine Reuben putting himself at the first of the line, even though Joseph has been the favorite child and he was assumed dead for a while, now he's alive. I can just imagine, maybe in his mind, he thought the sin that he had committed was so far away, in such a distant traces of yesteryear. But I'm sure he was first right beside Jacob, listening. Jacob called, Genesis 49, Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Gather yourselves together, and hear, ye sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father. Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. Unstable as water I have a translation here from my text. I have turbulent as water. Now, it's necessary to understand that the excellency of dignity, excellency of power might be better understood as to excel, because turbulent as the water, you will no longer excel. In other words, up until this point, you might have been chugging along thinking all is well, and here you are with your ear closely attuned to what might be coming your way. Because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defiledest thou it. He went up to my couch. That's all that's said. Should have been Reuben's portion, a double portion. This is why Joseph, with his two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, make up that double portion in the blessing. Should have been a birthright continuance, but because of what happened, there's not even a mention. Firstborn, he's given that. He's remembered as the firstborn, because indeed he is. And let me just see if I can find the same passage here out of what is the NIV translation to read something to you. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. So all of these years, Book of Jubilee says that Jacob, Israel, was wroth and addressed the matter, but we have no mention of it in our own text. All of these years there is silence until this time, where it should have been a time for Reuben to think in his mind, I shall receive, and yet not. Now what's interesting is this passage, this chapter, here are like instead of a written will, here's a speaking out of the blessings and descriptions of the diversity of peoples who we will be looking at in the coming weeks. But what is important here is that Reuben is not completely disregarded, although he does not get the promises that he would have obtained otherwise, had he not done what he did. He's not completely disregarded. If you keep moving through the Bible, you find some very interesting insight about Reuben and the Reubenites and the descendants of Reuben. But most importantly, we're talking now about a people they are in Egypt, they will become slaves, and in the fourth generation they will go out. And each, as they go into the promised land, eventually under Joshua's lead, each will be assigned a territory. And what's fascinating is that Reuben, along with Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh, will actually get land that is outside of the land that God promised. And what's so interesting is that while the kingdoms are still one, not broken up between north and south, you can't see where these people will end up. But once the kingdoms divide, the territory that Reuben is in, which if you were looking at a map, would be essentially the upper tip of the Dead Sea, right before, around Mount Nebo, and just before crossing what would be into the renamed Jebus, Jerusalem. That land will be part of the north, considered the tribes of Israel versus the south, Judah. That will be important when we talk about the deportations that will occur between the north and the south, to understand who was where in what territory and what might have happened to these people. So this is almost the most basic way to set up something to lay the foundation for later information, starting here with the firstborn. Now, I've done all this kind of laborious and long-winded to say if you keep going from Genesis into Exodus, and they have not yet entered into the land, but under Moses' direction, just as the one article that I read to you talks about, it's interesting that half of the tribes will stand on one mount, the Mount of Blessing, and the other half on the Mount of Cursing. And it is Reuben and a few other tribes that will stand on the Mount of Cursings. And it's interesting that part of the things they must utter out have to do with defiling the father's bed. And I thought, that's interesting. That would surely, for those who were descendants and children, they would surely remember what the father's sin was. If you keep, following all along, you'll find some interesting dynamics about these people. Some of the descendants of Reuben are just downright terrible. In fact, there's a record of, I think it's Dothan and his brother, that basically sass and take up against Moses. These are descendants of Reuben, who God basically had no tolerance for and did away with them. But the grace of God is that if you get to the last chapters, as I mentioned, of Ezekiel, you see that in the future time of the rebuilt temple, the land allotment, Reuben is there, just as he was and his tribe, speaking of his tribe and his people, just as it was at the very beginning, just as it was while they traveled and moved the tabernacle from place to place. Here it is envisioned at a future time, the land allotments, and Reuben is there. And sure enough, in the book of Revelation, we encounter the tribe of Reuben, 144,000, chosen out of that tribe to be the preachers of righteousness. And this is why I said to you, two things must be really understood if you're going to take further steps to understand the lost tribes and the end times teaching. That God set out and put his heart on a people, knowing their frame. God set out and put his heart on you, knowing your frame and knowing my frame. He didn't say, "Come unto me, all who are perfect and perfectly laden." He said, "Come unto me with open arms, embracing, understanding, knowing his omnipotence." Think of this, to even know our thoughts and to understand our shortfallings. And yet there is this incredible picture of grace for the sin that should have had, if you read the legal portion of this book that describes what punishment should be meted out when the law finally is issued to a son who defiles his father's bed, it was death. And that should have been, even though this was before the law, that should have been the lot of Reuben. Yet instead, he simply addressed as the firstborn that position. Remember, I said to you 3 words, that position was forfeited. The promise passed on to another, but the position, my friends, although he would never have the position he could have had, the position was never erased. And this is why I tell you it's not only important to understand the thread that goes through the Bible, but to understand God knows our frame. He knows our failures. And when you look on a person like Reuben, somebody might say, "Well, I haven't done something like that." Keep your mouth shut. Maybe in the big scheme of things you've done worse by hypocrisy or whatever it is. I'm not here to check a box and to define sin. Sin is falling short. A miss is as good as a mile. And what I want to tell you is the love of God, that even for this firstborn, when we look to the firstborn after Christ, we talk about Christ as the first fruit of his kind and the first begotten of the Father. And we're told into the New Testament that because of his status and for my faith, I become co-heirs and I receive the promise and I receive the position. And if you will, I also receive the property, not the property of birthright and double portion that way, but the property that is the right to every child of God. Christ in you, the hope of glory, the riches that are unsurpassable, unmeasurable, undefinable. You're not able to understand, or I'm not able to understand the depth of these things, and yet he grants them to us. We do not deserve them. You know, I used to come to you really in the very early days of doing ministry, and I say early days because it seemed like a million years ago. And I remember even though I understood the message of grace, I remember not being as firm in trying to express this, having had so many brothers and sisters who were the saved, bleached, washed, holy, cleansed, and everything else, come and tell me what was wrong with me, I realized something, that as I read and studied this book, which is all that God is concerned with for me in my calling, that I know the people in this book and I understand the people in this book are given to show me something, just like the law being given, no one could keep it because there's no perfect one. The message is not just tracing Reuben, the firstborn, but it's the firstborn of every child of God from the moment Christ is formed in your heart by faith, and the glorious truth that no matter what valley of the shadow of death or the shadow of turning or the shadow of darkness you have walked through, God's love is superabounding to those who recognize and understand who they are and the impossibility of His amazing grace to condescend down to find you, and like the one that gets lost, to retrieve you, to put you on His shoulder or in His bosom and take Him to you as His own. Greatest miracle, the greatest miracle that these people, who people say have disappeared or we're not quite sure where they are, very simply put, will become a people that everywhere you turn have been scattered across the face of the globe, and in every portion of the globe you will find these scattered people who are not lost, and in the last days God will raise up out of each of these, out of Reuben, 12,000 to preach as preachers of righteousness and proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ, which I'm doing right now, and it's the good news to say, thank God we have a Savior, and oh, what a Savior we have. If you have come in here today trying to figure out what it feels like, what it looks like, what should be happening, forget about all that and hear the words that I said. In Christ, you have everything you could possibly need to make it to Him, with Him, in Him, and to make it all the way home. That's all you need, folks. That's my message. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.